as Enuma Elish may be, there are at least certain points where there's intriguing parallels. And that, of course, has been one of the most fascinating aspects of the discussion as to how exactly do we understand the connection between these two. A few little details. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but are some of the ones that maybe are just of interest in our present conversation. One of the parallels is that in both accounts, both in Enuma Elish and in the Genesis account, great acts take place by virtue of the spoken word. In Genesis, God said, "Let there be light." In Enuma Elish, the gods speak and things happen. But I want us to always keep our eye not just on similarities, but on differences. The big difference between the Genesis account of God speaking and the account that we find in the creation myth is that in the creation myth, the speaking is kind of like magic incantations, you see. The gods say certain words that are sort of like voodoo or some kind of, formula statement that by some sort of magic causes things to happen. Notice how in Genesis there's none of that. God isn't doing any incantations. God's power is not questioned. God speaks and it happens, you see. So you've got a parallel, but you've also got what clearly represents an alternative understanding of the nature of the power of God. Another point that's similar, but where there's a little bit of difference, is the nature of light. Both accounts have light coming into the picture before the sun is created. It's always interesting, isn't it? We, of course, think light comes from the sun. The ancients didn't think that way. They thought of light as a prior reality. The sun shines, but there would be light even without the sun, would be their view. That seems to be the biblical view. God creates light, you see, early in the story. Later, 2 or 3 days later, he creates the sun. And this does represent in both counts an idea that the power of God comes in as that which brings order in the place of chaos. And one of the most primitive and ongoing understandings of humankind has been that light implies order, darkness implies disorder. Even if I could just right now do a little experiment and shut off all the lights in this room and plunge us into darkness, would you feel that that was an organizing experience? We immediately feel the trauma of being plunged into darkness, and we're not so sure now where things are. Well, humankind has had that understanding all the way through. So the bringing of light has always been associated with bringing order to a place of chaos. And in both accounts, we find it happening. But again, in the case of the Genesis record, God simply speaks, and the light is there. Whereas in the Enuma Elish account, it involves much, much more of a contest. Much more of a question as to what the outcome is going to be. Everybody's biting their nails. They're not so sure who's going to win this battle. In the Bible, there is no contest. Isn't that interesting? There's no contest. There's no battle, no question. Nobody's standing around wondering who's going to win. This is not a contest. This is God acting, but God acting in a way that was comprehensible to the ancients, you see. Another little detail that we see, this, by the way, is in the second day, is the creation of this dome. We mentioned this earlier, the idea that there's a great dome up there and that there's waters beyond it seems to be the assumption of the Genesis account, doesn't it? Speaking of waters above the firmament or the dome, waters below, that does, at least on the face of it, sound strikingly like what we find in Enuma Elish. Again, what's different, however, is that once again there's no contest, there's no question where the power lies. God simply speaks these things into being. He just announces it. Let there be an expanse. Let there be a dome. Let there be a firmament. It happens. And it was so. You see, these are powerful words. To a Sumerian reading that Genesis account, we don't know if they ever had a chance to because they predated the Hebrews by 1,000 years, but, to a Sumerian reading that would have been a slap in the face to their account of creation. Because here's a deity who doesn't have to fight. Here's a deity who's not, in the least bit disturbed by the vicissitudes of the created order. He simply speaks, and it was so, you see. And the great power of a statement like that is supposed to say there's a different way of thinking about the creation than this bizarre conflict of all kinds of competing forces that leave us in a great deal of concern and question about what the outcome might turn out to be. We have other details here. As you know, we have the placing on the fourth day of lights in heaven. That is again a parallel between the two. Marduk places the sun, the moon, and the stars in this, expanse of heaven to regulate, to time the calendar, as it were, of the day and the year and so on. We have a similar kind of thing in the Hebrew account, Genesis chapter 1. And that was, again, a point where there's a considerable amount of similarity, but again, the differences, I think, are notable. That in this case, God is simply placing those things there by his sovereign authority, and that they will become the rulers under God's control of life and the way we live it, the calendar by which we live, and so on. And that became a very important part of the Hebrew understanding. Their figurative understanding of these heavenly bodies was that they were somehow associated to rule on earth. When the Genesis says, let them rule, the Hebrews actually took that rather seriously, and they had an understanding that the powers of great civilizations, whether it was Babylon or Assyria or whatever, were backed up in some sense by heavenly powers, principalities. That was a Hebrew understanding. It's never taught in the Old Testament as such. It's implied in parts of the book of Daniel, but nevertheless it was a common view that was associated with the Hebrews and others as well. That's why when you read in the Old Testament of great political upset, you see, the collapse of a great civilization, oftentimes the figurative description of that will be in terms of the powers of heaven being shaken up, the sun darkened, the moon not giving its light, stars falling from heaven. That kind of language is found in the book of Isaiah, for example, chapters 13 and 14, to describe the collapse of Babylon, a political power. But the figurative way of saying it is to tie it to those celestial bodies that are ruling. The collapse of Babylon would be the collapse of Babylon's stars, if you will. And that kind of figurative language is carried all through the scriptures. It's why sometimes we in our non-Hebrew tradition don't get it. We read in the Bible, the sun doesn't give its light, and we think, oh, how's that going to happen? We want to immediately interpret it a little bit too woodenly. The stars fell from the sky. Imagine that. Well, the Hebrews didn't take it. They weren't saying the stars are actually going to fall from the sky. It would only take about one of them to do us in, It wasn't that at all. It was that this is describing the great collapse of political power. And this all goes back originally to that sort of Genesis view of the nature of the heavenly bodies and how they functioned in human experience. The fifth day we have the creation of these great sea monsters. Again, in the Enuma Elish, they are threatening creatures. In Genesis, they are fully under God's control. But maybe one of the most striking points of similarity and difference comes in the sixth day with the creation of humanity. In the biblical account, we are said to be created in the image of God. There is some, in both cases, connection between humankind that is distinctive with respect to the relationship to God or the gods. In the Enuma Elish account, however, we are created to be slaves. Humankind are created to serve the gods in a kind of slavish fashion. Our lives are conceived of as being hard lives of rigor, in which we are doing all we can to please the gods in a kind of quid pro quo worship. So the ancient Sumerian view was that the gods needed my help, and so I would bring sacrifices. Those would nourish the deity, and in turn the deity would maybe answer my prayer. Quid pro quo, this for that. Deity, I'll do this for you if you'll do that for me. And we have all kinds of reliefs and so on from that time in history in which you see that sort of religious practice being, sort of depicted. The Bible knows nothing of quid pro quo worship. That's why the Old Testament says, if I were hungry, I wouldn't tell you. I own the cattle on 1,000 hills. God doesn't need our worship. God doesn't need our sacrifice. We don't sacrifice to God for him. We do it for us. That's something we need. He doesn't need that. And the Genesis 1 account is already giving us that. And it's giving us an entirely different understanding of the dignity of humankind. Notice that in Genesis 1, humankind are created in the image of God, not just with his blood, but to bear his imprint, his signet ring. We are placed here to rule. Let them have dominion. Nothing of that in Enuma Elish. There's no sense of the dignity of our status. We are to expand this place of order. We're placed in a garden, but the garden is to be pushed out. And this growth of order is to continue taking place as we, in service to God's great destiny for us, do this labor of bringing, as it were, beauty where there was ugliness and so on. And all of this is part of the great celebration of our worth. Well, this is very foreign to the kind of thing we find in Enuma Elish. So what I'm trying to say in all of this, if you can you'll follow me with the details here, is you have this surprising correlation followed by, at the same time, some very surprising and interesting differences. Genesis 1 has been subjected to interpretive efforts that go on a whole spectrum of options. So on the one hand, I've read, and probably you have too, those who've taken the view of Genesis 1, this is simply the Hebrews borrowing from Babylonian mythology. It's just warmed over myth, and that's all there is to it, and end of conversation, And that you'll find that in some circles, and to this day, you can pretty commonly find that view out there. Then I have other people on the other side of the spectrum, you know them as well, and they want to make Genesis 1 a scientific explanation of what God did several thousands of years ago, and if you'd been there with a camera, you could have taken pictures of that stuff. There's people out there like that. Maybe in this room, I don't know. But just kind of an insistence. The Bible says it, that's the way it is. If you don't believe that, you don't believe the Bible. End of conversation. I've had that kind of conversation. And when I say, I'm not so sure of that, they just call me a liberal. You might like to know that I move in interesting circles in my life, and I've been in some places where I was called a liberal, and in other places where I was called a conservative or fundamentalist. That means I must be right? Does that mean that? That's all I can figure. I'm a Presbyterian, that's what I am. And Presbyterians famously try to find the balance, the middle way, and that's what I want to try to suggest to you here. I think both of those views are fundamentally misguided. To say the Hebrews simply borrowed from the Babylonians is not to do any kind of justice, really, to the Genesis 1 text. To say that we have to take, however, the terms of Genesis 1 as describing in some kind of literal fact what actually happened does present some colossal problems. I think, proper approach here is to say that God is speaking in a way that was comprehensible to the first people that were going to read this text. And if we are going to come and in a kind of artificial insistence say, oh no, it's got to be scientifically accurate, that is what gets us into difficulty. Because what does scientifically accurate mean? What does it mean? We live in the year, what is it, 2011 already? And we have an idea of what scientific accuracy means. We have a certain view of the world and so on. You realize if we went back 500 years current, up-to-date scientific accuracy would look very different, right, wouldn't it? And if we went back 1,000 years, current, up-to-date, accepted scientific accuracy would look very different. And if we went back 1,500 years, it would look different yet. So we've got times in history when flat Earth was scientific accuracy. We have times in history when Newtonian physics was scientific accuracy. We live in a time when Einsteinian physics is, but who knows? In 500 years, maybe some new genius will come and give us a new vision of scientific accuracy. And you realize if the Bible spoke and what was contemporary scientific accuracy for us today, it would, by the majority of people who've looked at this, been viewed as wrong because it wasn't scientific by their standards. Why would God strap himself to that? My own conviction is if God did speak to us with scientific accuracy, none of us would get it. You know? John Calvin says, God lisps to us in his word. Now, lisp, he means, that was kind of the term that was used in his day for baby talk. God comes to us in this remarkable book, so profound. You can spend a lifetime, multiple lifetimes examining it. And Calvin says what God is doing is speaking to us here in baby talk. If God actually spoke to us with the wisdom he has, it would so transcend our understanding, it would be utterly incomprehensible to us. So as you, as a grandparent, speak to a 2-year-old in very limited, tiny words, vocabulary that hopefully is comprehensible to that child because you love that child, so God gets down on his hands and knees and speaks to us in tiny little syllables that we can understand because he loves us. And why should we be offended if God has decided in the original formulation of this text to take the world as it sort of casually appears and then explain that behind all of that is a great sovereign God who was in no contest with anybody, who simply spoke these things into being. He did the things that were apparent to the human eye in such a way that there could be no question that he is the God of gods, Lord of lords, and that we are bound to worship him. And if we get lost in the deep weeds of, well, you know, is this scientifically accurate? We have utterly missed the point. The point is that God is God. He did it. And he did it by methods that we probably certainly don't get yet. But that he did it. And that can be a foundation for worship, it seems to me, is a perfectly legitimate meaning to draw out of this remarkable Genesis 1 text. So if that makes me a liberal, so be it. That makes me a fundamentalist, who cares? You know, what I care about is the Word of God, this great truth communicated, and the Lord Jesus Christ, who is declared to be the one in whom all things consist. And so, if that's what we get out of this text, then I think we got the right answer.